You're not Indian. You're not Indian. You're not Indian. No. Everybody know you're a pretendian. What's good? It's your brother YK the Truth. American law proves that black people are not indigenous to America. Let's go. Now, the government acknowledges the fundamental injustice, cruelty, brutality, and inhumanity of slavery and Jim Crow laws, apologizes to African Americans on behalf of the people of the United States for the wrongs committed against them and their ancestors who suffered under slavery and Jim Crow laws. So, America knows what they did wrong. If you're an Indian and you're indigenous to this land, you should have some type of treaties, sovereign laws, something that proves you was already here. If you have no history to validate your claims, you are not those people. So let's play the video. This is Congress. Let's see what they had to say.
As Conrad's 26.
Madam President, I ask consent that the clerk read the entire text of the resolution.
Without objection. As Conrad's 26, apologizing for the enslavement and racial segregation of African Americans. Whereas during the history of the nation, the United States has grown into a symbol of democracy and freedom around the world. Whereas the legacy of African Americans is interwoven with the very fabric of the democracy and freedom of the United States. Whereas millions of Africans and their descendants were enslaved in the United States and the 13 American colonies.
Let's pause right there. They said millions of Africans. Millions of Africans. They didn't say millions of Indians. You know, the Abos love to grab a video of a senator saying that we're Aboriginals, right? But they don't want to go to this video where they said millions of Africans were here.
At the very fabric of the democracy and freedom of the United States. Whereas millions of Africans and their descendants were enslaved in the United States and the 13 American colonies from 1619 through 1865. Whereas Africans forced into slavery were brutalized, humiliated.
1619 to 1865. We're talking about the slave trade.
Dehumanized, and subjected to the indignity of being stripped of their names and heritage. Whereas many enslaved families were torn apart after family members were sold separately. Whereas the system of slavery, racism against people of African descent, upon which it depended, became enmeshed in the
racism against people of African descent. Did she say racism against people of Indian descent? This is a government resolution. Now, we need more than an apology, because you know you did wrong, but we need our check. Let's keep going. That's another video.
Social fabric of the United States. Whereas slavery was not officially abolished until the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States in 1865, after the end of the Civil War. Whereas after emancipation.
Now, we got the 13th Amendment. We have laws that are in place that proves we are of African descent, right? Show me some treaties, you Abos. Show me some sovereign laws. Show me something. And don't pull up the Indian rights, because that don't prove that those are you. But when we're dealing with terms like African descent, we know that Negro means African descent. We know who they're talking about. So you can't just bring up the Indian Rights Act as if that proves that that is you. It's not. Let's play the video.
As forced into slavery were brutalized, humiliated in 1865. Whereas Africans forced into slavery were brutalized, humiliated, dehumanized, and subjected to the indignity of being stripped of their names and heritage. Whereas many enslaved families were torn apart after family members were sold separately. Whereas the system of slavery, racism against people of African descent, upon which it depended, became enmeshed in the social fabric of the United States. Whereas slavery was not officially abolished until the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States in 1865, after the end of the Civil War. Whereas after emancipation from 246 years of slavery, African Americans...
So even look at the Civil War that proves slavery happened. So if something happened, it would be something in history that would prove it. You guys have nothing in history that proves you're Aboriginal.
United States in 1865, after the end of the Civil War. Whereas after emancipation from 246 years of slavery, African Americans soon saw the fleeting political, social, and economic gains they made during Reconstruction eviscerated by racism, lynching, disenfranchisement, black codes, and racial segregation laws that imposed a rigid system of officially sanctioned racial segregation in virtually all areas of life.
So we got black codes. We got black codes that verify our history. And we're going to speak on it today. I'm going to speak on it today. Right? So you got the South Carolina. This is the Negro Law of South Carolina, 1848. And this law proves that Negroes and Indians are not the same. We're not the same. It says the Act of 1740, Sec. I declares all Negroes and Indians. So if Negroes and Indians were the same, why wouldn't they just put all Indians or all Negroes? Why does it say Negroes and Indians? So that shows they are two distinct people. Free Indians in amity with this government, Negroes, mulattoes, mestizos, who now are free, accepted to be slaves, the offspring to follow the conditions of the mother, and that such slaves are chattels, personal. They are personal. Under this provision, it has been uniformly held that color is prima facie evidence that the party bearing the color of a Negro, mulatto, or mestizo is a slave. But the same prima facie result does not follow from the Indian color. So that shows that the Indian and the Negro are not the same. Sec 3, Indians and descendants of Indians are regarded as free Indians in amity with this government until the contrary be shown. In the second proviso of Sec 1 of the Act of 1740, it is declared that every Negro, mulatto, once again showing that they are two different people, mulatto and mestizo is a slave unless the contrary can be made to appear. Yet, in the same, it is immediately thereafter provided the Indians in amity with this government accepted, in which case the burden of proof shall lie on the defendant. All right? So this is where you got people that's claiming their Indian heritage, and you got all of these mixed Indians, mixed. That's the only time you will see a mix-up is when we're dealing with mixed-blooded Indians. The Indians in amity with this government accepted, in which case the burden of proof shall lie on the defendant. That is, on the person claiming the Indian plaintiff to be a slave. The latter clause of the proviso is now regarded as furnishing the rule. The race of slave Indians or of Indians not in amity to this government is extinct, and hence the previous part of the proviso has no application. Sec 4. The term Negro. Now, this is going to body y'all. So, if you got ancestors on your genealogy, right, in 1848, well, and further down the line, the term Negro is confined to African, slave Africans, the ancient Berbers and their descendants. It does not embrace the free inhabitants of Africa. So why does people like root words say things like, show me a Negro in Africa? Show me a Negro in Africa. How if it does not embrace the free inhabitants of Africa, such as the Egyptians, Moors, or the Negro Asiatics, such as the Lascars? Sec 5. Mulatto is the issue of white and the Negro. When the see, so everybody want to say, oh, well, mulatto was Indian. In South Carolina, it says the mulatto is the issue of the white and the Negro. Set 6. When a mulatto ceases and a party bears some slight taint of African blood, ranks as white, is a question for the solution of the jury. Now, let's go to the one drop rule. What is the one drop rule? Because you guys love to bring up Walter Plecker in the Racial Integrity Act, but the law also defined Negro as having any Negro blood. Whatever. Dichotomous racial classification was also invented in colonial times with blood fraction laws defining a Negro as having more than a given fraction of African ancestry. North America's first blood fraction law in 1705 used a 1/8 rule. A person was black if one great grandparent was entirely of African ancestry. By the 1910, 20 states classified citizens by blood fraction, most using 1/4 or 1/8. So when you was dealing with the Virginia law, in Virginia, we know that a Negro meant of African descent. However, appearance also played a role in racial definition in pre-1911 Arkansas, as exemplified by the case of the 1861 Freedom Case, Guy versus Daniel, in which slave Abby Guy was awarded her freedom largely because of her appearance and behavior. Before 1911, Arkansas railroad segregation law defined Negro as one in whom there is a visible and distinct admixture of African blood. However, the emergence of scientific racism gave rise to the notion that a person could look and self-identify as white, but still somehow be black. This is the Act of Arkansas. Section 4. Person in whom there is a visible and distinct admixture of African blood, for the purposes of this, be deemed to belong to the African race, and all others shall be deemed to belong to the white race. So we have laws in place that proves our ancestors were the African descent. But what laws do you Abos have that proves your ancestors was Aboriginal or Indigenous to America? You have none. Your history does not fit your theory. Your history does not fit your theory. Now, no, Abos love to say that the act, the Racial Integrity Act, it affected all 50 states. The Racial Integrity Act didn't. Let's play Sister Betty going in with Joe Brown. Let's play the video.
Oh, I'm going to show you why. It's not the only federally recognized tribes that this applied to. This man literally was a state registrar, and his policy, he was able to convince the 50 states to classify all Indians as colored.
That is a lie. No, the Watapleca Act, also known as the Racial Integrity Act of 1924, was a Virginia state law. It did not directly affect all 50 states. All right. If you read the first beginning, it says he was a physician in the first Virginia state. So we're talking about Virginia. And if you read down, it says Virginia Indians. It don't say all 50 states. And this is how I'm going to prove it. We're going to go to the Loving case,
Oh,
right? And Richard Loving and Mildred Jeter, they married in D.C. So that debunks Sister Betty. Whole L. Richard Loving, a white man, and Mildred Jeter, a woman with both African American and Native American ancestry. So we're dealing with mixed blooded Indian, had left Virginia to get married in Washington, D.C. A short time after their return to Virginia, they were arrested for their violation of Virginia's ban on interracial marriage. After pleading guilty, the Lovins were sentenced to either a year in jail or a conditional ban from returning to Virginia as a couple for the next 25 years. So, according to Loving and Mildred Jeter, it didn't affect 50 states because they went to Washington D.C. Now, let's talk about the 54th Regiment. All right? In January of 1863, the Secretary of War Stanton finally gave John A. Andrew, the abolitionist governor of Massachusetts, authorization to form regiments that could include persons of African descent. The governor had long been an advocate of raising black regiments from the free black population. Like most abolitionists, he felt the surest path to citizenship for black Americans was for them to be allowed to fight and die for their freedom and their country. So that proves that black people are not indigenous to America because the people who fought in that war, you got Robert Shaw. This is the guy that was from the movie Glory. And one of my ancestors fought in those wars. All right? Then you got the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It was rooted in the struggle of Americans of African descent to obtain basic rights of citizenship in the nation. Anti-slavery initiatives had gradually abolished the peculiar institution in the northern states by the 1830s, but free blacks were not accorded full citizenship rights. All right? In the math of the Civil War, Northern Republicans in Congress proposed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution that granted the newly freed slaves freedom, citizenship, and a right to vote. Respectively, several civil rights acts were also passed in an attempt to protect the freedom of the free population. During the Reconstruction era, African American men participated in electoral politics as voters and as public officials. So we got the Civil Rights Act that shows it was for people of African descent. We got the act prohibiting the importation of slaves. This shows a group of people being brought from Africa. So this is what we call receipts, paper trail. Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution stated that Congress could not prohibit the importation of persons prior to 1808. 20 years later, the act to prohibit the importation of slaves in any port or place within the jurisdiction of the United States from and after the first day of January 1808 was passed. The 1808 Act imposed heavy penalties on international traders, but did not end slavery itself, nor the domestic sale of slaves. Not only did it drive trade underground, but ships caught illegally trading were often brought into the United States and its passengers sold into slavery. So we got the act prohibiting the importation of slaves. So this proves that our ancestors had to come from somewhere else. Let's go. Now we have the Naturalization Act of 1870. The Naturalization Act of 1870 explicitly extended naturalization rights to all aliens of African nativity into persons of African descent, while denying the right to all other groups of non-whites, in particular Asians. The law promoted integration and equality for African Americans, but maintained racial distinctions that denied naturalization rights, access to citizenship to Asians. Now, you know what this proves? That our ancestors were citizens before Indians. So show me a law that proves you was Indians. You abos can't show a law that proves any of your claims. History does not agree with you. If something happened, it's going to leave a receipt. It's going to leave some type of evidence. You ever watch Forensic Files and somebody commit a crime? They can leave a piece of hair behind. And anything, something is going to be left behind. So you're telling me that you guys were Indians and there's nothing left to prove it? I mean, they erased and destroyed every single thing. Because even when you look at our African ancestors who lost their names, who lost their religion and culture, in some places of the United States, there's still remnants of African culture and African history. It's still there. But according to this spooky stuff that y'all believe, there's no history that validates that. Now you got the Dred Scott case, 1857. In the case of Dred Scott versus Sanford, the Supreme Court ruled that black men, whether free or enslaved, had no rights which a white man was bound to respect. All right, the Dred Scott case proves that. And then you got the Constitution of the Republic of Texas designated people of 1/8 African blood as a separate and distinct group, took away citizenship, sought to restrict property rights, and forbade the permanent residence of free blacks without the approval of Congress. So we got Texas laws that prove this. Back to the Dred Scott case. Now this is the Dred Scott case right here, right? Now if you go down, it said number 4, a free Negro of the African race whose ancestors were brought to this country and sold as slaves. You see it? Is not a citizen within the meaning of the Constitution of the United States. So this proves that Negro is African. So all throughout history, it's showing you that Negro is African, a free Negro of the African race. Naturalization Act, 14th Amendment, all 13th Amendment, ratified in December, made slavery legal throughout the United States, but it did not address other fundamental questions about the status of newly freed African Americans. Then you got the Indian Citizen Act, and that's in 1924. So they didn't become citizens until 1924. And nothing proves that you're Indian. It doesn't. African Americans began to assert their citizenship claims in the early in nation's history, and they were granted citizenship under the 14th Amendment in 1868. Native Americans, on the other hand, were granted U.S. citizenship in 1924. Now you got the Militia Act of 1862. So when you do your genealogy and you find all your so-called Indian ancestors who fought in the Civil War, guess what? They are African. You have African ancestry. You have found your African genealogy. I don't care how much you deny it. I don't care how much you think it's not true. You have found your African ancestor, whether you like it or not. Whether you like it or not. All right? So, Section 12, under the Militia Act, and be it further enacted that the president be, and he is hereby authorized to receive into the service of the United States for the purpose of constructing entrenchments or performing camp services or any other labor or any military or naval service for which they may be found competent. Persons of African descent. It says nothing about Indian descent, Native descent, Aboriginal descent. It says African descent. Sec 13, and be it further enacted that when any man or boy of African descent who by the laws of any state shall owe service or labor to any person who during the present rebellion has levied war or has borne arms against the United States or adhered to the enemies by giving them aid and comfort shall render any service as is provided for in this act, his mother and his wife and children shall forever thereafter be free. Any law, usage, or custom whatsoever to the contrary, notwithstanding, provided that the mother, wife, and children of such man or boy of African descent. So you found your African ancestry. Sister Becky, we saw your records. We seen your peoples fighting in the war. 33rd Infantry. We found your African ancestor according to the Militia Act of 1862. This is not my belief. This is documented. This is not what I'm just making up. This is a documented law. This is an act. Now you got Congress. You got so many resolutions that's being put in place, right? Representative Bush. So y'all love talking about that one white guy who said we are Aboriginal, right? But what about the resolution 414, recognizing that the United States has a moral and legal obligation to provide reparations for the enslavement of Africans and its lasting harm on the lives of millions of black people in the United States. Representative Bush. Let's read it. Since we are the Indians, right? Where is anything in play for us as Indians? Tell me what is in play. What reparations? What is in play for us to gain right now for being an Indian? Not a thing. Nothing. We're not going to get anything for being an Indian because we're not an Indian. We're not going to get anything for being an Indian because we are not Indians. So why would you want to claim something? I think this is some type of government agency that's making people run away from their African ancestry so they won't have to pay us reparations. So let's talk about it. Resolution 414, 118th Congress, first session, recognizing that the United States has a moral and legal obligation to provide reparations for the enslavement of Africans. Does it say Indians? No, Africans, in its lasting harm of the lives of millions of black people in the United States. You got Miss Bush, Miss Lee of California, Miss Taylor, Miss Presley, Miss Bowman, Miss Ramirez, Miss Lee of Pennsylvania, Miss Omar, Mr. Jackson of Illinois, Mr. Green of Texas, submitted the following resolution. Recognizing that the United States has a moral and legal obligation to provide reparations for the enslavement of Africans. Right? Now let's read it. Let's keep reading it. Whereas, to meet the international legal obligation of reparations, the federal government must compensate descendants of enslaved black people and people of African descent. Does it say Indian descent? Does it say Aboriginal descent? No. In the United States, to account for the harm of chattel slavery, the cumulative damage of enslavement, and the epochs of legal and de facto segregation. Right? Let's see what we're blaming them for. What did they do? What did they do? All right. It says, whereas the full length of legalized slavery impact on blacks' wealth creation and well-being today, including the nearly 300 years of chattel slavery from the year 1502, when enslaved Africans were brought to Hispaniola, and later their descendants brought to United States territory, to the year 1789, when the first Congress met, must be recognized and fully accounted for. Whereas, over the course of nearly 300 years, at least 12,500,000 Africans were kidnapped from their homelands by European traders and forcibly brought across the Atlantic Ocean in one of the largest forced displacements in human history. And at least 2 million did not survive the horrifying, brutal, grueling journey across the Atlantic, also known as the Middle Passage and Mayafa. So this is the resolution, and they breaking down what they did. Whereas 1619, a year before the Mayflower arrived on American shores, marked the first year white Virginians purchased around 30 enslaved Angolans. So we got a Congress, we got a bill about slavery, about Africans. Show me anything for you guys. You can't do it because you're not those people. So here's another case. You got the United States versus the Choctaw Nation and the Chickasaw Nation. These are the peoples who own Smoke Signal's ancestors. And according to Article 3, the Choctaws and Chickasaws, in consideration of the sum of $300,000, hereby cede to the United States of 98 West longitude, known as the lease district, provided that the said sum shall be invested and held by the United States at an interest not less than 5% in trust for the said nations until legislators of the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations, respectively, shall have made such laws, rules, and regulations as may be necessary to give all the persons of African descent resident in the said nations at the date of the Treaty of Fort Smith and their descendants. So show me some treaties that proves you guys are Indians. Show me some laws that prove it. Because when you do your genealogy, right, and you find those freedmen in your ancestry, right? Well, according to this act, right, those ancestors would have had to been people of African descent. See, when you show them these things, the first thing they do is deny it. But you cannot deny the law. This is a case, all right? Let's keep going. This is how the descendants of African slaves became Indians, right? Last month, the Supreme Court of the Cherokee Nation handed down a decision that likely surprised many people. The court said that the descendants of African slaves who lived on Cherokee land in the 19th century are, for all intents and purposes, Cherokees, and they want to be considered such. Once again, the court said that the descendants of African slaves, not Indian slaves, not Aboriginal slaves, but Indian slaves. I know you guys hate to see this, but freedmen is people of African descent. You got to hold this L. Now, this is from black slave owners, free black slave masters in South Carolina, 1790 to 1860. It said during the period from 1810 to 1847, John Garden was the largest colored planter of St. Paul Parish, but he used the Indian descent of his mother to escape the limitations of being classified as a free black. See, once again, we're dealing with mixed-blooded Indians. We never deny that there are Africans out there with Indian ancestry. We never denied that. We never said that you guys don't got some Indian ancestry. We never said that. But to say that you're all Indian and you're nothing else, that's an outright lie. It's a lie. So let's get back to it. Yet both he and his mother, Flora Garden, associated with free coloreds and married into the case of colored persons. This right here proves that a colored person is an African, because we already established that it can't be an Indian, right? We established that. In 1795, John Garden applied for membership in the colored fraternity society called the Brown Fellowship Society. Also, he married the daughter of George and Ruth Gardner, who were free mulattoes of Charleston. In addition, the second marriage of his mother, Flora Garden, was to a black man named Robert Baldwin. In spite of the fact that John Garden was designated as free Indian, his father may have been of African descent. But the laws of the state permitted persons of free Indian descent on their mother's side to declare themselves as Indians. Although John Garden was closely aligned to the free black community, he rejected his African ancestry. Who does that sound like? Who rejects their African ancestry? The Abos. They claim their European ancestry all day, proud of it. Oh, I found some family in Scotland or Ireland. But when they find an African, they deny it. Just like OTK, how we found his African. They deny it. Just like these people denied their African ancestry. Just like John Garden denied his African ancestry. And used the heritage of his mother to avoid the special tax imposed on free Negroes, as well as the other disadvantages of being classified as being black. So even throughout history, it was you get more benefits being an Indian than having African ancestry. That's the way it is. Maybe this has something to do with how you guys are denying that African ancestry today. Right? Here's another case in the same book, Black Slave Owners. Right? It says, in general, those persons with conflicting documents which state their race were usually free persons of colors. So it's people who had tried to claim Indian and tried to claim white, but they had problems with their documents, which state their race were usually free persons of color. As a result of their wealth and fair complexion, they were occasionally accepted as white citizens. Consequently, when the federal census marshals reported the composition of their households, they occasionally listed them as white persons, even though the marshals may have been aware of their African ancestry. So when you start seeing a lot of these white, mulatto, well, mulatto, yeah, they're going to put that, but white, and even though you know your ancestors were colored, that's because they had fair skin. Because I got ancestors who had fair skin, and they were actually free people of color. I could show you them that they were free people of color. It was not unusual for the descendants of mulatto slave owners, as well as the descendants of mulattoes who intermarried with Indians, to reject their African ancestry and pass for free Indian. Many mulattoes claimed to be free Indians to escape the limitations of being classified as a free black. Once the free mulattoes were accepted as free Indians by the local authorities, they were exempted from paying the state capitation taxes imposed on the free black community. They were also permitted to give sworn testimony in court litigation concerning the race of their fellow companions who sought to evade the state capitation taxes by proving themselves to be descendants of free Indians. So this shows you that our ancestors had African ancestry, and many of them who had mixed ancestry denied their African ancestry. This is why you probably don't hear a lot of stories about it, because it was better for you to not be an African than to claim African and have all these state taxes, especially if you had color. Now we got the South Carolina anti-law literacy laws. This is May 10th, 1740. The South Carolina Assembly enacted the bill for the better ordering and governing of Negroes and other slaves in this province, also known as the Negro Act of 1740. The law prohibited enslaved African people from growing their own food, learning to read, moving freely, assembling in groups, and earning money. It also authorized white enslavers to whip and kill enslaved Africans for their rebellions. Does it say Indian? Does it say Aboriginal? No, it says African people. Negro and African is the same thing. No matter how much you deny it, it is what it is. Then you got the Act Concerning Servants and Slaves, 1705, Encyclopedia of Virginia, right? And this also proves that Negroes and Indians are not the same. And for further Christian care and usage of all Christian servants, be it also enacted by the authority aforesaid, it is hereby enacted that no Negroes, mulattoes, or Indians, so that shows Negroes, mulattoes, and Indians are not the same, although Christians or Jews or Moors, Mohammedans, or other infidels shall at any time purchase any Christian servant, nor any other, except their own complexion, or such as are declared slaves by this act. And if any Negro, mulatto, or Indian, Jew, Moor, Mohammedan, or other infidel, or such as declared slave by this act, shall notwithstanding purchase any Christian white servant, the said servant shall ipso facto become free and acquit from any service then due, and shall be held, deemed, and taken. And if any person have such Christian servant shall intermarry with any such Negro, mulatto, Indian, Jew, Moor, or Mahat. So that proves, once again, that Negroes and Indians are not the same. Now, you got Oklahoma laws. Oklahoma became a state in 1907 with the state constitution defining all persons except Negroes as legally white. Negroes, what is a Negro? Persons with any amount of African ancestry were required to be segregated in schools, restaurants, etc., from persons of all other races in Oklahoma. So it doesn't say Negroes, persons with any amount of Indian ancestry. It don't say that. I know it hurts. Now, let's go to the Black Law Dictionary. The Black Law Dictionary. The word Negro is a black man, one descended from the African race, and does not commonly include a mulatto. And you've got a state, Felix versus the state. Mestizo, a name given to the issue of an Indian and a Negro. So if mestizo is a name that's given to an Indian and a Negro, how can Indian and Negro be the same? You got to hold this L, man. Then you got the Virginia Act 1660 on English running away with Negroes. The act is passed in Virginia colony to discourage white servants from running away with indentured and enslaved African people. Laws, these is laws. Showed you the 1705 that define any child, grandchild, or great grandchild of a black person as a mulatto. And it says, in 1866, the state decreed that every person having 1/4 or more Negro blood shall be deemed a colored person. In 1910, the percentage is changed to 1/16. Finally, in 1930, the Code of Virginia defines colored persons as having any trace of African ancestry. These are laws. Enactment of Virginia, 1662. The law determines that children who are born to enslaved mothers and fathers by white men be considered slaves. This also defines the codification of white as the legal description used to refer to colonists. Africans began to be referred as black or Negroes. People and Native people as Indians. So Africans were black or Negro, and Native people were Indian. So how come when you do your genealogy, you act like you don't know who a Negro is? Checkmate. 1663, Maryland passes a law that all imported African people are to be given the status of slaves. African people. African. 1664, a Maryland law passed and prevents enslaved people from obtaining their freedom via English precedent that allow it under particular circumstances. Similar laws are passed in the colonies of New York, New Jersey, the Carolinas, and Virginia, where a statute is passed declaring that enslaved African people who are baptized into Christianity are not exempt from bondage. So we got all of these laws, all of these slave codes, 3/5, all of this stuff. That the first Fugitive Act, the first Fugitive Slave Act authorizes local government to siege and return a slave African escaped African people to their slaveholders. Proof. This is proof. This is not your land. Where are your tribal governments? Tribal governments have existed for millennia, predating the United States. Their sovereignty is derived from their people in connection to their ancestral lands. If you was already here, Abo, how come there's no laws, no tribal governments that help you? Where are your treaties? Treaties between the U.S. government and tribes recognize the tribe as distinct governments and formalize a nation-to-nation relationship. If we're from America, we will have laws in place that grant us sovereignty. The U.S. Constitution recognizes Indian tribes as distinct governments and authorizes Congress to regulate commerce with them. Landmark court cases, such as Worcester versus Virginia, affirmed that tribes have distinct sovereign powers and that state laws generally don't apply within tribal lands. Where are your sovereignty laws? Where are your treaties? Where's the history that say you are indigenous to America? You're quick to say you don't come from slaves. I don't want that slave story. But you want the story that somebody pencil whipped you out of history, stole everything, stole your land, stole America from you, and made you believe you was African. But you would take that narrative, but not the narrative that we was taken from our homeland and brought to a foreign land and had this thing happen to us. You would accept having Europeans as slaves, then having those same Europeans turn around and put a foot in your behind and erase everything. You would take that story. Give me the slave story. Because I'd rather come from slaves who fight to get their freedom than to come from people who had Europeans enslaved, right? Even though there's no proof of none of this happening. Let's just fit your fantasy. And to have the Europeans turn around and take my land. This is what you want to come from? You are not sovereign for a reason. Essentially, Tribal sovereignty ensures that tribes have the right to govern themselves. You do not govern yourself. We do not govern ourselves. We got European police officers gunning us down in the street. We got police governing our communities. You don't get to determine your membership. You don't get to enact laws. You don't get to manage your own affairs. This includes the right to protect the health, safety, and welfare of tribal citizens within their territories. African Americans, like other groups of citizens born or naturalized in the United States, are considered sovereign within the context of the nation's overall sovereignty, but they are not a separate sovereignty entity within the United States. I wonder why. This status arises from historical treaties. Get it? Historical treaties and agreements made between the U.S. government and Native American tribes. So if that was your history, right? Where are your treaties? If you was the Indians and you was the ones fighting in the laws, where are the laws that say you are those people? You don't have any because you are not those people. Where are the treaties, the historical treaties and agreements? When European settlers arrived, they recognized Native American tribes as distinct nations with their own systems of governance. Over time, treaties were signed between these tribes and the U.S. government, acknowledging their autonomy in exchange for land, peace, and other terms. So, according to American law, you are not indigenous to this land. Now let's go back to the Negro laws of South Carolina. It says free Indians and their descendants, unmixed by African, the state X-ray blood, are entitled to all the privileges of white men. Let's read it. It's right here. You can blow it up. Free Indians and their descendants, unmixed by African blood, are entitled to all the privileges of white men, except that of suffrage in the office. So that's another law. You got to hold that L. Now, you got the Negro Law, Section 7. Whenever the African taint is so far removed that upon inspection, a party may be fairly pronounced to be white, and such has been his or her previous reception into society in enjoyment of the privileges usually enjoyed by white people. No specific rule as to the quantity of Negro blood which will compel a jury to find one to be mulatto has ever been adopted. Between 1/4 and 1/8 seems fairly to be debatable ground. When the blood is reduced to or below 1/8, the jury ought to always find the party white. When the blood is 1/4 or more African, the jury must find the party a mulatto. Do you see? Mulatto means you have African in you. So now, this is also the Negro law. The next point upon which the committee differ from the author is with the reasoning contained in Chapter 1, Section 19. The laws laid down in this section is doubtless correct, but the argument used to overthrow the law are such as cannot meet the views of the committee. Although by the Constitution placed upon a higher status in society than the African race, many substantial reasons exist why the Indian should not be allowed to enjoy the full privileges of a white. The servile condition of the Negro race and the well-established policy of the state to include them from all political franchises is of itself a strong reason why the Indian should be debarred. So this is also showing you once again that Negro and Indian are not the same. Once again. Now let's go to the law dictionary and look up Indians, Aboriginal inhabitants of North America. You see, you got treaties. This is the treaty with the Creeks in 1866. Article 2. The Creeks hereby covenant and agree that henceforth neither slavery nor involuntary servitude otherwise than in the punishment of crimes, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted in ordinance with laws applicable to all members of said tribe, shall ever exist in said nation. And as so much as there are amongst the Creeks many persons of African descent. Slavery not to exist amongst the Creeks. Rights of the African descent. So the only treaty that you're in is the ones that's saying you're African. So you got to hold this L. There's no laws that prove you are indigenous, you are the Aboriginal. Everything is saying you have some African in you, might have some Indian in you, might have some European in you. But it's not saying you are the Aboriginal. You got the Negro law. This is Florida law, right? And it says right here, 4 jurisdictions prohibit marriages between white persons and persons of Negro blood to the 3rd generation. The North Carolina statute is typical. All marriages between a white person and a Negro, or between a white person and a person of Negro descent to the 3rd generation inclusive, are forever prohibited and shall be void. Other states prohibit marriages between white persons and persons of more than 1/8 Negro blood. For example, Florida prohibits marriages between white and Negro persons and provides the following statutory definition. Let's get into it. The word Negro, colored persons, mulatto, or persons of color, when applied to persons, include every person having 1/8 or more of African or Negro blood. So, when you do your genealogy and you pick up them census records, you pull up the census records, and you pull up these records, and it says colored, it says Negro, it says whatever, mulatto, you have found your African ancestor. And this is why they don't show their genealogy. They'll be on live with you arguing 9 hours straight, 24 hours. But the moment you say, pull up the genealogy, what they say, I don't got to prove nothing to you. Meanwhile, they're arguing with you day in and day out, talking about they this and they that. But when you ask them for the evidence, I don't got to prove nothing to you. How does that sound? It don't make any sense, right? A further variation in definitions is found in the Oklahoma miscegenation statute, which prohibits the marriage of any person of African descent. Everything is saying African, but somehow you guys don't know you're African. As defined by the Constitution of that state, to any person not of African descent, the Constitution defines persons of African descent as followed. Wherever in this Constitution and laws of this state, the word or words colored or colored race, Negro or Negro race are used, the same shall be construed to mean or apply to all persons of African descent. The term white race shall include all other persons. In Virginia, it is unlawful for any white person to marry anyone except the white person, or a person with no other admixture of blood than white and American Indian. So when these abos pull up the Racial Integrity Act, they're showing you that they don't even realize that Negro means African, right? They don't even, it's proven that Indians and Negroes are not the same. Colored persons and Indians are defined. Every person in whom there is an ascertible any Negro blood shall be deemed and taken to be a colored person. And every person, not a colored person, having 1/4 or more American Indian blood shall be deemed American Indian, except that members of Indian tribes existing in this commonwealth having 1/4 or more of Indian blood and less than 1/16 of Negro blood shall be deemed tribal Indians. Kentucky, which prohibits the marriage between a white person and Negro. Georgia is one of the few states that defines a white person. The definition includes only persons of the white or Caucasian races who have no ascertainable trace of Negro, African, West Indian, Asiatic in their veins. So these are the laws, okay? And all the laws are saying you're not indigenous to this land. You're not an Aboriginal. We got to stop repeating it. We got the laws here. We got the definitions here. You got Juneteenth. On June 17, 2021, President Joseph R. Biden Jr. signed into law the bill that established Juneteenth, National Independence Day, June 19th, right? Commemorates June 19th, 1865, the date Major General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas, and delivered General Order Number 3. So we got more cases. Announcing the end of legalized slavery in Texas. Historically, it has been a holiday celebrated by people of African descent in the United States of America. The struggle for freedom and equal rights has continued, and so has the celebration of Juneteenth as people of African descent and others commemorate Juneteenth in their home. So we got holidays that prove this. Here are some sovereign nations, and here are some sovereign cases. Right? Tribal sovereignty refers to the right of American Indians and Alaska Natives to govern themselves. Where are those cases for African Americans? For the Abos who say they are indigenous to this land? Show me Johnson versus McIntosh. Show me Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. Show me the Indian child welfare. Show me something that proves it's you are who you say you are. Because right now, you're fraudulent. You're fraudulent. You got the 3/5 compromise in the U.S. Constitution, referring to the counting enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of representation and taxation. This clause did not apply to American Indians. So how are you calling yourself an American Indian and then turn around and say that they was doing the 3/5 to you guys, to us? How can you say anything about the Three-Fifth Compromise when it did not apply to American Indians. The Constitution originally stated that Indians not taxed were excluded from the population count, nor that they were counted as three-fifths of a person. This provision was specific to the enslaved population, and it was later superseded by the 14th Amendment. You gotta hold that L. So according to the Three-Fifths Compromise, you're not an American Indian. Sister Betty, you're not an American Indian. Aboriginal power, you're not an Aboriginal. Because one minute you're using native books and Indian books, but you want to claim you're an Aboriginal. So we got the expansion of slavery in Massachusetts. In the mid-1600s, authorities did not see the small enslaved population as a threat. On May 27, 1652, the Massachusetts General Court legislature ordered that all Scotsmen, Negroes, and Indians servant to the English. See, once again, it's proven that Negroes and Indians are not the same. Servant to the English from the age 16 to 60 could train with the militia. 4 years later, however, in May 1656, the General Court ordered that henceforth no Negroes or Indians shall be armed or permitted to train. Why were authorities becoming fearful of enslaved people to be sold? A likely Negro boy. Within a decade of importing its first enslaved Africans, Massachusetts has chosen enslaved labor over imported white, indentured servants. England entered the slave trade in 1663 when King Charles II granted a charter to the Royal Adventurers to Africa. But most enslaved Africans were sent to the Caribbean and southern colonies. Another law that prohibited Africans from arming themselves. You guys have no laws that proves you're indigenous to this land. You have no laws. With all of this being said, American law proves that black people are not indigenous to America. We got the apologies. We got the Negro law. We got the one-drop rule. We got the Act of Arkansas. We got the Racial Integrity Act. We got Plecker's death and Lovings versus Virginia. We got the Militia Act. We got the Civil Rights. We got the act prohibiting the importation of slaves. We got the Naturalization Act of 1870. We got the Dred Scott case. We got the history of free blacks in Texas. We got the 14th Amendment. We got the Indian Citizenship Act that proves we are not those people. The Militia Act. We got Resolution 414. We got the Chickasaw versus the United States. We got how the descendants of African slaves became Indians. We got black slave owners. We got African American education in South Carolina anti-literacy laws. We got the Act Concerning Servants and Slaves, 1705, Virginia laws. We got the Oklahoma laws. We got Black Law Dictionary. We got the Code of Virginia, Maryland, South Carolina. The First Slave Act. You don't got sovereignty laws. Negro laws. Laws Dictionary. Treaty, 1866. Who is a Negro? Florida Law Review. Juneteenth. We got the Three-Fifths Compromise. Prove that you couldn't have been an Indian because it did not apply to Indians. We got treaties that you don't have nothing to do with those treaties. And we have the slavery in the 17th century Massachusetts. So with that being said, you guys are not indigenous to America. Please share this video, like this video. If you want to support the channel, you can purchase my book, Grandma Said, Rise of the Black Internet Pretendians. I'm out. Peace.